I've lived long enough to recognize when a person returns from somewhere their mind wasn't meant to go. There's a stiffness in the shoulders, a tremor in the voice, a way they avoid looking at anything that might remind them of what's still echoing inside. I've seen grief take many shapes in my neighbors here in Wisconsin, but nothing quite prepared me for the night Margaret came back. She stood on her porch under the dim porch light, clutching the railing as if the world beneath her feet had shifted. I remember thinking her face looked like someone had shown her a truth she wasn't ready to carry. Margaret was always a quiet soul, steady in her routines, gentle with her words, careful not to trouble anyone with her burdens. I'd grown used to seeing her at the same hour every morning, sweeping her steps or watering the small row of plants by her door. But that night, she didn't move like herself. Her breath came shallow, unsteady. Her eyes kept drifting over my shoulder, as if she expected something, or someone, to step out from the darkness behind me. When she whispered my name, it wasn't in the soft tone she used for simple neighborly greetings. It was strained, raw, threaded with something close to fear. She told me she had seen something ahead, something she wasn't meant to witness, and for a moment I felt the familiar prickle along my arms that comes when the world stops behaving the way we believe it should. She spoke slowly, like every word risked unraveling the fragile grip she still had on herself. I didn't ask her to explain. Not at first. There are moments when questions feel like intrusions, and all you can do is listen to the tremor in someone's voice and understand that their life has shifted in a way you can't fully grasp yet. I only knew that whatever Margaret had seen wasn't just strange. It had carved something into her, a weight, a sorrow, a regret so sharp it left her trembling. And as she finally lifted her eyes to mine, I saw it, the quiet devastation of a person who had just confronted the kind of future that doesn't let you return untouched. Whatever time had shown her, it had undone her in ways she couldn't yet put into words. I didn't sleep much that night after Margaret came to my door. Even after she finally stepped back across her porch and closed herself inside, the quiet of the neighborhood felt different, as if the air had been stirred by something that didn't belong to our small Wisconsin street. I kept walking from room to room, unable to shake the sound of her voice or the look in her eyes. There was a heaviness to her words, a kind that doesn't come from imagination or rumor. It felt earned, lived, survived. Morning arrived gray and slow, the type of winter light that softens every edge. But nothing about Margaret softened. She didn't open her curtains like she usually did. She didn't come out to tend to her plants. She didn't even step onto her porch. Her absence settled over the neighborhood like a missing piece of a familiar picture. I found myself glancing at her windows more times than I'd like to admit, half expecting her to appear and half hoping she wouldn't, because I wasn't sure I was ready to see what the night had done to her. By noon, I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. Something in me, call it concern, call it unease, pushed me to walk over and check on her. I didn't plan to ask anything. I only wanted to make sure she was still herself, or at least whatever part of herself hadn't been shaken loose by whatever she claimed to have seen ahead. When she finally opened the door, even just a few inches, I knew it wasn't the same Margaret looking back at me. Her expression held a quiet dread, the kind reserved for people who have witnessed something they'll spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. Hi, my name is Norman. Before we continue, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel. It truly helps me keep sharing these moments in time. Have you ever felt that someone carried a weight they couldn't explain? Thank you to everyone who's been watching and supporting these stories. Now let's return to the story. I stood there on Margaret's porch, the cold settling into my hands as I waited for her to say something, anything, that might help me understand what had shaken her so deeply. The door was still only half open, the draft slipping through the narrow gap. She didn't seem to notice. Her eyes weren't focused on me, but somewhere past me, as if she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Margaret," I finally said, keeping my voice low, "I just wanted to check on you. You didn't look well last night." She blinked slowly, almost like the sound of her name brought her back to the present. Her shoulders lifted in a shallow breath, but her voice didn't come. I could see a blanket draped over her shoulders, the kind she kept folded neatly on the back of her couch. She wasn't wearing shoes. It was almost noon, and she looked as though she hadn't moved from that spot since sunrise. I'm here," she whispered at last, though it sounded more like she was reminding herself than reassuring me. I nodded gently. "Can I come in for a moment?" Something in her expression tightened. Not fear exactly, but hesitation, as if letting me in meant letting the moment become real. Still, she stepped back just enough for me to enter. The house was dim, curtains mostly drawn, with only a soft wash of gray light filtering through the living room window. Her usually tidy space looked untouched, frozen in time. No coffee cup, no book on the table, no sign of her morning routine. She settled slowly onto the edge of her armchair, but she didn't lean back. She sat upright, hands clasped, staring at the floor. I waited. I'd learned over the years that silence can be a kind of permission. Sometimes people need the quiet to decide which part of the truth they're ready to speak. "When I left yesterday," she began, barely above a murmur, "I didn't plan to be gone long. I thought I was taking a simple walk, just down the road, just to clear my head." A small hollow laugh escaped her, without warmth. "It wasn't a long walk. It was something else entirely." She paused, swallowing hard, her fingers tightening around themselves. "I don't know how to explain it," she said. "I don't think I should even try. You'll think I'm losing my mind." "I won't," I told her. And I meant it. There was something in her voice that didn't come from imagination. Something lived in, as if her words carried a weight her body still felt. Her eyes lifted slightly, not meeting mine, but drifting toward the window, where the faint outline of her front garden sat motionless under the gray sky. "I saw ahead, Norman," she whispered, not in the way people talk about intuition or a feeling. I mean, I truly saw ahead. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the ticking clock on her wall felt quieter. "I don't know how I got there," she continued. "One moment I was walking past the old post office, and the next I wasn't. Everything felt wrong, familiar and wrong at the same time, the same street, but it wasn't the same. It was older, like time had continued without me." My hands stilled on my knees. I didn't speak. I didn't dare interrupt. "I saw someone," she said. "Someone I wish I didn't recognize. Older, tired, standing there waiting for someone who never came." Her voice caught, trembling, and for a moment I thought she might stop altogether. But she forced out the next words, each one sounding heavier than the last. And I knew it was my fault. Not in a metaphorical way, not in a way you can talk yourself out of later. I saw what I'd do. I saw the hurt I'd cause, and I saw how it would settle into her face, a face I wasn't supposed to see that way. Her eyes finally met mine, and in them I saw something fragile, something close to breaking. "Norman," she whispered, "I saw a future I shouldn't have touched." She clasped her hands even tighter, as if holding on to them was the only thing keeping her steady. And I came back feeling like time had left its mark on me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The room felt as if it had settled around her confession, holding it in place like dust suspended in a narrow beam of daylight. Outside, a truck rumbled faintly down the road, the sound fading quickly, swallowed by the quiet of our small street. Everything felt distant, normal life happening somewhere else, untouched by whatever Margaret had stepped into. "Margaret," I said carefully, "when you say you saw ahead, what exactly do you mean?" Her lips pressed together, and I regretted the question the moment it left my mouth. Not because I doubted her, but because asking her to describe something she was barely able to process felt cruel. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she reached for the arm of her chair, her fingers brushing the fabric as though grounding herself. "I don't know how long I was there," she said. "It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. There was no sense of it. The air felt thicker, heavier, like every second carried something it shouldn't." She paused, and her gaze drifted back to the window. "I heard things before I saw anything. Footsteps, a door closing, a voice calling out a name I hadn't heard in years." Her breath trembled on the next inhale. "My name, Norman. Someone was calling my name. Not the way you or anyone else says it. Older, tired, worn down." A cold shiver climbed up my spine. Not from fear, something else. A sense of wrongness, quiet and unsettling. "Then I saw her," Margaret whispered. At first I didn't understand who she was. She stood with her back to me, leaning on the railing of a porch I recognized but didn't. Not the same paint, not the same boards, but almost. It took me a long time to accept that it was the same house. My house, just further down the line than I ever expected to see. She paused again, swallowing hard. "I walked closer," she continued. "I didn't think about whether I should. I just moved. The air felt heavy around me, like it was resisting me. But I needed to see. I needed to understand. Her voice lowered, quieter than before, more fragile. And when she turned toward me, I understood more than I wanted to. Margaret's hands shook subtly and she pressed them together, as if trying to steady the tremor inside herself. She was older, Norman. Not old in the way one expects. Not slow or fading. Just tired. A deep kind of tired you can see in the eyes before you see it in the body. She exhaled shakily. And she looked right through me, as if she knew I was coming, as if she had been waiting. The room grew colder, though the furnace hummed somewhere in the hallway. I felt it too, that strange, unseen shift in the air when someone speaks of something the world shouldn't naturally allow. What did she say? I asked gently. Margaret shook her head. Nothing. Not at first. She only stared at me. And I felt... Her voice trailed, searching. I felt judged. Not by a stranger, but by someone who knew everything about me. Every choice, every regret, every quiet cruelty I tried to tell myself didn't matter. The silence that followed was heavy, stretching long enough that the ticking of her clock seemed painfully loud. She didn't need to speak, Margaret said eventually, because I already knew. I knew what I had done. Not yet, but someday. I saw it in her eyes. I saw what I would become, what I would cause. She leaned back slightly, the tension in her shoulders trembling like a held breath. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with anger or accusation. It was disappointment, a kind of disappointment that cuts deeper because it's the truth you already feared. Her eyes drifted upward, unfocused. She said, "You left her." Just that. Nothing more. I didn't speak. I couldn't. The words hung in the air like a verdict delivered decades ahead of its time. Margaret folded into herself, as if trying to make her body smaller, protect herself from what she had seen. And in that moment, Norman, she whispered, I realized the future doesn't shout. It whispers. And sometimes, that's worse. Margaret's last words lingered between us, quiet but heavy enough to shift the air in the room. I could feel something tighten in my chest, an instinctive reaction, the kind that comes when you realize someone is carrying a weight far greater than they should handle alone. She kept her eyes lowered, as if afraid that looking at me would make everything she'd said collapse into something too real to keep speaking about. I leaned forward slightly, careful not to intrude on the space she was holding on to. Margaret, who did she mean? I asked softly. Who did you leave? Her fingers curled around each other again. That's the thing, she said, her voice thin. I don't know yet. I don't know who she was talking about. But the way she said it, she paused, drawing a shaky breath. The way she said it felt like a memory I hadn't lived yet. A chill moved through me. Not fear exactly, but an unfamiliar sense of dislocation, as if time itself was bending subtly around her words. I had heard people talk about déjà vu, about strange dreams that feel like warnings. But this was something else, something deeper, something that didn't play by familiar rules. What happened next? I asked, trying to follow the thread without pulling it too hard. She stepped toward me, Margaret said, slowly, like she was carrying her own ache. And the closer she came, the colder the air felt. Not like winter cold, more like absence, like something had been taken out of the world around us. She rubbed her arms unconsciously, as if feeling the memory on her skin. I felt it inside me, a kind of hollowing. She lifted her eyes then, only briefly, but enough for me to see the lingering fear behind them. And then she reached out her hand. Margaret whispered, not to touch me, not to comfort me, just to show me something. What was it? I asked. A photograph, she said. Old, bent at the corners. It looked as though it had been carried for years. She held it where I could see the edge of it, but not the face. Her voice tightened. I think she knew I wasn't ready, or perhaps she didn't want me to see something too soon. I let out a slow breath. The idea of an older version of Margaret holding a photograph meant for her younger self felt unreal, and yet nothing about her manner suggested fantasy. There was no dramatization, no reaching for attention. She spoke like someone trying to make sense of a trauma too delicate to hold too tightly. She said one more thing before I came back. Margaret continued. Her voice changed when she said it, softer, smaller. Her gaze fell to her hands again. She said, you'll understand when it's too late. A long silence followed. I wasn't sure if she expected me to respond, or if she needed the space more than answers. So I let the quiet settle, the way a winter night settles over a street after the last porch light switches off. "How did you get back?" I asked eventually. Margaret shook her head. "I don't know. I closed my eyes because I couldn't stand looking at her anymore. And when I opened them, I was standing near the old post office again. Same sidewalk, same fading posters in the window. But the sky, it looked different, like a few minutes had passed, not whatever that was." She placed a hand against her forehead. "Norman, I keep replaying it in my mind. I keep wondering if I imagined it, if it was some kind of waking dream. But then I remember her eyes, and I know dreams don't hold truth like that." I understood what she meant. Some things you don't imagine. Some things leave marks. "And I'm scared," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Not of what I saw, but of what I haven't lived yet." I felt something shift in me then, a quiet resolve. I didn't know what she had stepped into or what it meant, but I knew one thing with certainty. Margaret wasn't meant to face it alone, not if I had anything to say about it. I left Margaret's house that afternoon with more questions than I cared to admit. The cold air felt different when I stepped back onto the porch, a little heavier, a little sharper, as if it carried the echo of her words. I stood there for a moment, pulling my jacket tighter around myself, watching the stillness of our street. Nothing had changed. The same bare trees, the same cracked sidewalk, the same quiet houses tucked behind their small fences. And yet, after what she told me, everything felt slightly off, as though the edges of the world had shifted. I walked home slowly, looking over my shoulder more than once, not because I expected to see something out of place, but because a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that the path behind me wasn't exactly the same one I'd just taken. I've lived long enough to know that fear doesn't always announce itself with panic. Sometimes it settles quietly, a small knot beneath the ribs, tightening with each step. Inside my house, the warmth from the heater wrapped around me, but the unease stayed. I made coffee without thinking, the motions automatic. The mug felt too warm in my hands, as if the contrast between the heat and the cold outside only deepened the discomfort in my chest. Margaret's voice replayed in my mind. "You'll understand when it's too late." I sat at the table, staring at the steam rising from my coffee, wondering why those words had lodged themselves so firmly in me. They weren't meant for me, not really. They were meant for her younger self, but somehow hearing them secondhand carried a weight I couldn't explain. It felt like a warning that had wandered off its intended path and landed in my lap instead. After a few minutes, I stood up and looked out the window toward her house. Curtains drawn. No movement. No shadow passing behind the fabric. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought the place was empty. But I did know better. She was in there, sitting with memories she hadn't lived and regrets she hadn't earned yet. Part of me thought I should leave her alone to process what she had seen. Another part of me, the part that understood loneliness all too well, knew that silence can turn into something dangerous when a person is sitting with fear that doesn't fit into the normal lines of life. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted to that pale blue that always precedes an early winter sunset. I found myself pacing near the front door, debating whether I should check on her again. I wasn't sure if I'd be intruding, but then I thought of the way her hands trembled when she talked about her older self, and the decision made itself. When I stepped outside, the cold bit deeper than it had earlier. I walked the short distance between our houses, noticing details I'd overlooked for years. The uneven brick along her walkway, the slightly leaning mailbox post, the pattern of frost forming at the edges of her windows. Things I'd passed every day suddenly felt fragile, as though they belonged to a world that could shift without warning. Before I reached her steps, her front door opened. Slowly, quietly, as if she'd sensed I was coming. Margaret stood there wrapped in a thick sweater, her hair slightly undone, a tiredness in her posture that made her seem smaller somehow. She didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, she looked relieved. "I didn't want to sit alone anymore," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I was hoping you'd come." I nodded and stepped closer, but I didn't speak. I let her guide the moment. "Can we walk for a bit?" she asked. "Just around the block. I can't stay in the house right now. It feels different, like the walls are listening." There was no hysteria in her voice, no dramatic tremble, just a quiet truth spoken by someone who had seen something the world wasn't built to hold. "Of course," I said. She closed the door behind her and fell into step beside me. And as we began walking down our familiar street, I felt the strange invisible thread between us tighten. A thread pulled taut by something waiting just ahead, somewhere between fear and understanding. We started down the sidewalk in silence, our steps slow, careful, as if we both feared the world might shift again beneath us. The neighborhood looked the same as always. Same mailboxes, same familiar porches, same wind chimes clinking softly from Mrs. Warren's house across the street. But there was a strangeness clinging to everything, a thin film of unease that made even the most ordinary shapes feel like they were holding something back. Margaret kept her arms folded close to her body as we walked, not the way someone does when they're cold, but the way someone protects a bruise. Her gaze remained on the ground for several steps, then drifted toward the houses, then back to the ground again, never lingering long in any direction, as if the world had become too loud, too sharp. "I keep thinking about her face," she said finally, her voice carrying softly into the cold air. "The way she looked at me, not angry, not surprised, just tired." She paused, then added, "It's strange how a person can age in ways you recognize and still feel like someone you don't know." I nodded. "Sometimes we become strangers to ourselves long before the years show it." She gave me a faint, grateful look, though it didn't last long. When I saw her, myself, older, it didn't feel like I was looking at a possibility. It felt like I was looking at a certainty. Her steps slowed, like something had already been set in motion. We reached the corner and turned. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of distant pine and cold asphalt. Evening was inching closer, settling into the cracks between houses. "Did you see anyone else there?" I asked gently. Margaret hesitated before answering. "No, but I felt someone else. I know that sounds ridiculous, but the moment I arrived, wherever I arrived, the air felt like it was carrying someone's absence." She shook her head lightly, almost embarrassed. "It didn't feel empty. It felt incomplete, as if I'd stepped into a place shaped by someone who wasn't there anymore." The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long, quiet shadows across the pavement. We kept walking. "You said she held a photograph," I reminded her. "Do you think it was connected to that absence?" Margaret pressed her lips together, thinking. "Maybe. I couldn't see the front of it. She held it just enough that I knew it mattered, but not enough to understand how." Her voice softened. "I think she wanted to protect me, or maybe she wanted to delay something. I'm not sure which." Her hands tightened around her sweater sleeves. But whatever was on that photograph, it hurt her. I could feel it. Even before she spoke, the idea sat heavily between us. A photograph held by an older version of herself. A truth withheld. A warning half given. We walked past the small church at the end of the block. Its stained glass windows were dark, reflecting only the faint glow of the streetlights. Margaret slowed her pace. "You know," she said quietly, "I always believed life moves in a straight line, one day after the other, one choice leading to the next. But now I'm not so sure. It feels more like everything's happening at once, like the future is sitting beside me, waiting for me to trip into it." I looked at her, noticing the subtle tremor in her hands. "You're not alone in this," I said. "Whatever you saw, whatever it means, you don't have to face it by yourself." A soft breath escaped her, something between relief and sorrow. "Thank you, Norman," she said. "It means more than you know." We continued walking until the street curved gently uphill. The houses thinned out, giving way to open sky. The sun had almost dipped below the horizon, leaving a thin line of fading gold. Margaret stopped suddenly and looked around. Her brows drew together, her posture tightening. "Norman," she whispered, "does it feel different to you?" I listened. The world was quiet, too quiet. No cars, no dogs, no hum of distant traffic, just silence. "Yes," I said at last. "It does." She swallowed, eyes unsettled. This is how it felt, before it happened. And for the first time, I realized Margaret wasn't just remembering her journey. She was sensing something again. Margaret's words settled over me like a drop in temperature. Not sudden, not sharp, just a quiet shift that made the hairs on my arms rise. She stood perfectly still, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed on the darkening end of the street as if she expected it to fold in on itself. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. She didn't look at me. The air, the stillness, it's the same. I listened again, this time more deliberately. She was right. There was a kind of pause in everything around us, a hush that didn't belong to winter evenings. The wind had died. The distant hum of the highway, usually a constant, was absent. Even the cold seemed suspended, waiting. Margaret wrapped her arms tighter around her torso. Before I ended up there, the world felt like this. Not dangerous, not loud, just wrong. We stood side by side in the deepening dusk, our neighborhood stretching ahead like a familiar photograph with some detail slightly altered. I felt a strange pressure in the silence, as if sound had been drained from the world. It wasn't frightening exactly. It was unsettling in a slower, more patient way. "Let's keep walking," I suggested softly. "Maybe it's just the weather." But Margaret didn't move immediately. She studied the lamppost flickering near the corner, the way its pale circle of light looked strangely distant, as if the glow wasn't reaching as far as it should. Only after a long breath did she nod and take the next step. We walked further uphill, our footsteps sounding too loud on the pavement. She moved cautiously, scanning the street, her attention shifting with every faint flicker of light or passing shadow. I stayed close, not touching her but making sure she knew I was there. "Norman," she said quietly, "I can't shake the feeling that something followed me back. Not a person, not a presence, just the weight of that place." "How can a place follow you?" I asked, keeping my tone gentle. She frowned slightly. "I don't know, but ever since last night I feel like time has gaps. Like moments aren't sitting right in my mind. I'll turn my head and feel like I missed something, or like something moved too quickly." Her words carried a quiet desperation, not wild fear, just a tiredness that ran too deep for someone who hadn't lived through what she had. "Do you feel it now?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, there's something in the air, like we're standing close to a memory that hasn't happened yet." We reached the top of the small hill, where the street opened to a view of distant rooftops and the faint lights of a few shops. From up here, the quiet felt even stranger. A town that usually murmured with evening life now looked like it was holding its breath. Margaret stopped again, her shoulders stiffening. "There," she whispered. I followed her gaze. At the far end of the street, a porch light flickered faintly. Not unusual in itself, but the pattern caught my eye. A slow blink, then darkness. A pause, another blink, then darkness again. "That's the house I saw," she said, voice trembling. "Not exactly, but close enough. The pattern of the light. It's the same." I felt a shift inside me. Not belief, not disbelief, just a quiet acceptance that something strange was threading its way through our ordinary street. "What happened when the light flickered there?" I asked. She swallowed hard. I remember feeling like I shouldn't keep walking, like the road ahead wasn't part of where I belonged anymore. She paused, but I kept walking anyway. The wind finally stirred, brushing past us in a thin, uncertain breath. "Margaret," I said softly, "you're safe here. You're not there." "I know," she replied, "but sometimes it feels like the line between here and there isn't as straight as we think." We turned back toward home, neither of us speaking. The quiet followed us like a shadow that didn't quite match our steps. And as we descended the hill, I couldn't shake the feeling that the world around us wasn't simply silent, it was listening. When we reached Margaret Street again, the quiet hadn't lifted. It clung to the houses like frost, thin, pale, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention, but present in every corner if you knew how to look for it. Margaret walked a few steps ahead of me now, as if pulled by some invisible thread leading her forward. Her movements were slower, deliberate, as though each footstep needed to be considered. "Do you want to go back inside?" I asked gently as we approached her walkway. Margaret stopped, her hands tightening at her sides. "I'm not sure," she said. "I don't know if being outside is better, but being in that house, it feels like the walls remember something I don't." She wasn't being dramatic. She spoke with the simple clarity of someone describing a headache or a heavy heart. Just a fact. We stood in front of her porch steps, neither of us eager to cross the invisible line between the quiet street and the muffled stillness inside. The porch light flickered as we approached, dimming for a moment before regaining its glow. Margaret flinched. "That didn't happen before," she whispered, At least, not until yesterday. I glanced at the bulb. It wasn't unusual for winter to make lights finicky, but something about the timing felt deliberate, too aligned with the unease pressing against Margaret's voice. "Let me check it," I offered, but she shook her head quickly. "No, just leave it. It's not the light that scares me." She stepped up onto the porch, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Then she stopped again, closed her eyes, and exhaled a shaky breath. "Would you stay for a little while?" she asked. Her voice was small, fragile in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "Of course," I said, "as long as you need." Inside, the house felt colder than mine had. Not temperature cold, more like a stillness that settled into the corners, making the air feel heavy and slow. Margaret walked to the living room but didn't sit down right away. She stood near the window, fingers tracing the edge of the curtain. "Last night," she said quietly, "after I came back, the house felt wrong, like something was missing, something I didn't notice at first." "What was missing?" I asked. She shook her head. "I don't know. I walked through each room and everything looked exactly as it should, but it didn't feel the same. Like the version of me who came back wasn't the version who left." Her words struck me with a quiet force, not because they were impossible, but because she didn't sound confused. She sounded observant, like someone describing the shift in a familiar melody that suddenly holds a dissonant note. She finally sat down on the armchair, her hands resting on her knees. They trembled just enough for me to notice. "Margaret," I said gently, "what is it you're most afraid of right now? Not yesterday, not that place, but right this moment." She blinked slowly, thinking. Her voice came out soft but steady, that nothing I do now will change what I saw. Her eyes drifted to the window, to the dark outside, and that somehow everything is already in motion, that the older me wasn't warning me to avoid something. She was preparing me to accept that I'll still do it. I didn't rush to answer. "People in pain don't need quick comfort. They need the space to breathe around their own truth. Margaret," I said finally, "the future isn't fixed. Whatever you saw, maybe it was a reflection of what you were afraid of, not what you'll do." She looked at me then, really looked, but she knew me, Norman. She knew what I'd done, and she said it like it was already carved into stone. A faint tremor passed through her shoulders. The room felt smaller, as if the air itself had taken a step closer around us. "I keep thinking," she whispered, "that if time opened a door, it wasn't by accident, and if it showed me something, maybe it was because I needed to see who I become." She drew in a slow breath, holding it for a moment before releasing it. "And I'm afraid," she said, voice trembling, "that I recognized her more than I want to admit." Margaret's confession settled into the room like a draft slipping in through an unseen crack. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. I watched her fingers twist together in her lap, the motion slow, rhythmic, as though she was trying to work something loose from inside herself. I wanted to tell her she was imagining it, that seeing an older version of herself didn't mean becoming her. But the truth was, the way Margaret spoke, the way she carried the memory, even I felt the weight of inevitability in it. She lifted her gaze to the window again. "Last night, after you left, I kept thinking about her eyes. I tried to convince myself they weren't mine, that maybe I'd seen someone else. But the more I sit with it, the more I know I've seen that expression before." "In a dream?" I asked gently. "No." She shook her head. "In moments I've buried. Times when I hurt someone, even if I didn't mean to. Small things that seemed harmless at the time, but lingered." She exhaled slowly, the sound thin and tired. The older me, she wore those moments like they'd piled on for years. I didn't speak. I let her find her own pace. "You know," she continued, "people always say regret comes from big choices, but I think it comes from the quiet ones, the ones you barely notice." She pressed her lips together. Maybe that's what I saw. A lifetime of small moments that added up to something I couldn't recognize until it was too late. She trembled slightly, and I leaned forward, elbows resting on my knees. "What happened after she spoke?" I asked carefully. "Before you returned?" Margaret took her time answering. Her eyes shifted back to her hands, tracing invisible lines across her knuckles. She looked at me as if she wanted to say more, she said. There was a kind of urgency, like she didn't have much time, or like she was afraid of losing something if she told me too much. She swallowed, and then she started to fade. My breath caught, not because of the impossibility of it, but because Margaret's tone didn't waver. She wasn't embellishing. She wasn't reaching for drama. She spoke like someone recalling a moment they still didn't have the strength to fully face. Fade? I repeated quietly. Yes. Not like disappearing. More like the world around her was pulling away. Margaret reached up and touched her temple. The edges of her blurred. Her voice sounded distant, and the photograph she was holding felt like the only solid thing in that moment. "What about the photograph?" I asked. Margaret hesitated, then closed her eyes as if replaying the scene. She lifted it toward me, she said. Not enough for me to see the face, just enough so I'd know it mattered. And as the world around her started to slip, that photograph stayed clear, sharp, as if it was anchored to something neither of us could change. A shiver went through her. It felt like she wanted me to take it, Margaret whispered, but I couldn't move. I couldn't lift my hand. She opened her eyes, her voice trembling. And then I was back. The room fell silent again, but it wasn't empty silence. It was thick, weighted, as though her words had altered the walls around us. "Margaret," I said softly, "whatever you saw, it doesn't mean you're trapped in it." She looked at me with an expression that wasn't quite disbelief, but wasn't hope either. "I'm not sure that's true. You're here," I reminded her. "You're still yourself. But am I?" Her voice cracked. I keep feeling like I'm standing in two places, like something inside me stayed with her, and something of her came back with me. I felt a coldness in her words, a quiet fracture forming somewhere beneath them. "Tell me," I said gently, "what does it feel like?" She held her breath for a moment before answering. "Like time is thinner," she whispered. "Like moments slip. I'll blink and feel like I missed a step, or like something is waiting just a second ahead of me." Her eyes drifted toward the hallway. "And last night, I heard something." I straightened slightly. "What did you hear?" She hesitated, fear flickering in her voice for the first time. "A voice," she said, "soft, close, calling my name." She swallowed hard, but it wasn't the older me. She paused, trembling. It sounded younger. "A younger voice?" I repeated, keeping my tone calm even as something tightened inside my chest. Margaret nodded, her eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the living room window. "Yes," she whispered, "like a girl, maybe 10, 11 years old. Soft, like she was standing right beside my bed." She drew in a shaky breath, and she said my name the same way the older me did. Tired, like she already knew something I didn't. The image unsettled me more than I wanted her to see. A younger voice calling from the darkness was the kind of detail that didn't belong to imagination. Not when Margaret had already seen something impossible. "Did you see anything?" I asked. Margaret shook her head. "No." I turned on the lamp, but the room was empty. Just my things, exactly where they always are. But I knew she'd been there. I could feel it, like someone had just stepped out of the room before I looked. Her fingers trembled. The memory wasn't fading for her. It was looping, replaying in a way that left its trace on her features. "Maybe it was a dream," I suggested softly, though I knew the words sounded thin. "I've dreamt before," she said. "Dreams don't stay in the air after you wake up. They don't make the room feel like it's still holding something." Her voice lowered further. "When I sat up, the air was cold. Not winter cold, just wrong, like the warmth had been pushed out." She closed her eyes, rubbing her forehead the way someone does when trying to ease a headache that isn't physical. For a moment, she continued, "I thought she was the girl in the photograph." I leaned forward. "You saw enough of it to know that?" "No," she admitted, voice cracking. "And that's why it scares me. I didn't see anything, not the face, not the background, nothing. But somehow, I felt like the girl's voice and that unseen photograph were connected." She swallowed. "It's like time is showing me two ends of a rope, and I'm standing in the middle, not knowing which direction pulls me." Her metaphor lingered, painfully clear. Silence filled the room, thick and expectant. I felt helpless in a way I hadn't felt in years, watching someone drown in something I couldn't see. The heater hummed faintly in the background, but it did little to warm the tension in the air. "Margaret," I said finally, "we can figure this out piece by piece. You don't have to do it all at once." She gave a small, bitter smile. "But I don't know which piece comes first. I don't even know if the younger voice was real." She lifted her hands. And yet, I remember the sound of her breath. I remember her hesitation before she said my name. How can something I never saw feel so real? I searched for the right words but found none that felt honest. Instead, I spoke the only truth I could offer. You're not losing yourself. How do you know? Her voice cracked. Maybe that's what happens when you see too far ahead. Maybe something inside you begins slipping out of order. I shook my head. You're overwhelmed. Anyone would be. This doesn't mean you're broken. Her eyes met mine then, shining, uncertain, searching for something steady to hold on to. I keep thinking, she said, her voice softening. What if that younger voice belonged to someone I haven't met yet? Someone I'll hurt, or someone who'll need me? She hesitated. What if she's the one I leave behind? A cold heaviness pressed into my chest. She wasn't speaking in riddles. She was wrestling with the weight of what she'd seen, with the unformed shape of a future she feared she couldn't escape. Before I could respond, a faint sound drifted from down the hallway. A soft tap, barely there but distinct enough to stop both of us mid-breath. Margaret's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded slowly. Another tap, gentle, measured, like fingertips against a hollow surface. Margaret's hand went to her chest, her breath catching. "That's the sound," she said, barely audible. "The one I heard before the voice." The house grew still again. No wind, no furnace click, just the quiet shape of someone, or something, waiting in the dark end of the hall. Margaret whispered my name, voice trembling. "Norman, I think time is slipping again." The tapping came again. 3 soft, deliberate knocks that seemed too measured to be the house settling and too quiet to be anything ordinary. Margaret froze beside me, her breath hitching in her chest. I felt her fingers graze my sleeve, not grabbing, not clutching, just reaching for something solid as the world around her shifted again. "Stay here," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the part of me that still believed that if I stepped forward first, the unknown might hesitate. But Margaret shook her head. "No," she said, voice trembling but firm. "I don't want to be alone in this. Not even for a second." I nodded. We took a slow step together toward the hallway, the boards under our feet creaking with a softness that felt amplified in the stillness. The hallway was dim. Margaret hadn't turned on the lights, and the fading daylight barely reached the far end. Every shadow seemed longer, stretched thin like quiet warnings. The tapping stopped as soon as we reached the threshold. Margaret's voice was barely a breath. This is where I heard her. We waited. Nothing. The silence felt like something we'd stepped into rather than something that surrounded us. I exhaled slowly and turned to her. "Let me check the bedroom. It could be a branch outside, or the vent." She gave a tiny nod, though her eyes said she didn't believe it. I walked ahead, each step careful, feeling an odd pressure in the air, like a room waiting for someone to speak first. When I reached her bedroom door, I pushed it open gently. The room was ordinary in every way. Neatly made bed, soft quilt, dresser with framed photos, curtains drawn halfway. But the air inside felt colder than the hallway, as if someone had opened a window moments earlier. Except the windows were closed. Margaret hovered behind me, her presence faint but tense. "Do you feel it?" she whispered. I didn't want to admit that I did, but the truth was unmistakable. Something in that room felt thinned out, as if the space was stretched just slightly beyond its boundaries. "I heard the voice from the corner," Margaret said, pointing toward the far side of the room. "Right there, near the dresser." I walked over to the dresser, scanning the surface. Brush, folded scarf, 2 framed photographs. Nothing unusual. But when I touched the edge of the top drawer, a chill crept up my fingertips, subtle but unmistakable. "Do you keep this drawer open sometimes?" I asked. "No," she said instantly. "Never." The drawer was open just a fraction, an inch, maybe less. Not enough to be noticeable unless you stood right in front of it. Not enough to be accidental. I eased it open. Inside were old letters, envelopes yellowed with age, stacked neatly as if untouched for years. Margaret stepped closer, staring down at them. "I haven't opened this drawer in I don't know how long," she said. "There's no reason it should be open." I lifted the top envelope carefully. The paper was thin, fragile. Her name was written on the front in faded ink. "Whose writing is this?" I asked. She hesitated. "My mother's." The room felt heavier, not supernatural, just emotionally dense. filled with the weight of memories that hadn't been disturbed in decades. I set the envelope down and looked at her gently. Maybe this is what you heard. The past doesn't always stay quiet. But she shook her head, her voice cracking. The voice wasn't from the past, Norman. It wasn't my mother. It was a child, a girl. Her eyes drifted to the open drawer again, and she sounded like she needed something. Before I could respond, the sound returned, but not the tapping. This time, it was a soft inhale, a breath, not ours. It came from the far corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest. Margaret grabbed my arm, not in fear, but in recognition. "That's it," she whispered. "That's the sound I heard." I looked toward the corner, but there was nothing there. Just the dim outline of the wall and a faint patch of darker shadow that seemed to shift when I blinked. Margaret took a trembling step closer. "Norman," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I think the girl is trying to reach me." And in that moment I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood. A quiet, undeniable sense that the world was holding its breath for whatever came next. Margaret didn't move at first. She stood near the corner of the room, frozen, her breath held tight in her chest. The faint sound, whatever it was, had faded, but the air still carried its presence, like the remnants of a voice that hadn't fully left. I could sense the tension radiating off her, a quiet dread mingled with something else, something closer to recognition. "Margaret," I said softly, "let's step back for a moment." But she slowly raised a hand, as though asking me to wait. Her eyes were fixed on the dark patch of shadow in the corner, the one that didn't seem to match the angle of the light coming from the window. "It sounded like she was right there," Margaret whispered, like she was standing just out of sight. Her voice trembled, not with hysteria, but with a fragile certainty that made me feel suddenly protective. I moved closer until I stood between her and the corner. "There's nobody here," I murmured, though even as I said it, part of me questioned the simplicity of the statement. The corner held nothing. No figure, no shape, just an uneven shadow stretching upward like a faint smudge on the wall. But the air in front of it felt colder, a stillness that didn't belong to the rest of the room. Margaret stood behind me, clutching her sweater. "Before," she said quietly, "when the older me spoke, when she said I'd understand too late, I thought she meant regret. I thought she meant fear." She swallowed hard. "But now I think she meant someone. A person." I turned to look at her. "Someone you haven't met yet." Her lips tightened with uncertainty. "Someone connected to me, but I don't know how, or why she would call my name like that." The letters in the open drawer rustled faintly, though there was no draft. Margaret's eyes flew to the drawer, panic flickering in her expression. "Did you see that?" she whispered. I nodded slowly, but I didn't move toward it. Some instinct told me that rushing around, trying to search for logical explanations, would only make things worse for her. Instead, I kept my voice low, steady. "Let's sit down for a moment," I said. "You don't have to stand here with this alone." She hesitated before walking with me back to the living room. She sat down on the edge of the couch, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I sat across from her, keeping my voice calm. "Tell me what you're thinking," I said. Margaret inhaled shakily. "I keep trying to connect everything. The older version of me, the photograph, the way the sky looked different. And now, this child's voice." Her fingers twisted again. "Nothing fits neatly. But it all feels connected in a way I can't explain." "You don't need to explain it," I told her. "You just need to tell me what it feels like." She let her head fall slightly forward, considering the question. "It feels like time is thinner, like something is pressing against the edges of my life, trying to be let in." A soft tremor passed through her. "And what scares me most is that it doesn't feel malicious. It feels familiar in a way that hurts." The way she said it struck me deeply. She wasn't afraid of being harmed. She was afraid of being confronted by something she wasn't ready to understand. We sat in silence for a few moments, the soft hum of the heater filling the room. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, but even that familiar sound felt distant, muted. Margaret lifted her head again. "Norman," she said, voice low, "what if the child is connected to the future I saw? What if she's the reason the older me was waiting? What if I'm meant to do something, or not do something?" I felt a quiet ache inside me watching her wrestle with possibilities she shouldn't have to consider. Margaret wasn't a woman prone to dramatics or imagination running wild. She was grounded, thoughtful, steady. Whatever she was experiencing felt large enough to melt the foundation of her certainty. "I don't think you're meant to solve this alone," I said. She stared at me, eyes damp. "I don't think I can solve it at all." Then, before I could speak again, the porch light outside flickered sharply, bright, then dim, then steady again. Margaret flinched. "That's the same pattern," she whispered. "The same flicker I saw there." She looked toward the window, her voice barely audible. "Norman, I think something is crossing over." The porch light steadied, but the air inside the living room didn't. A kind of quiet tension pressed down on the space between us. Thin, cold, almost metallic, like the way air feels before a storm you can't see yet. Margaret watched the window with her breath held tight, her shoulders drawn upward in that silent way people brace for something they can't name. "Margaret," I said gently, "you're safe. You're right here. But what if right here isn't what it used to be?" She whispered. She turned toward me, and in her eyes I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not fear exactly, but recognition, as if a part of her suddenly understood a piece of the puzzle she hadn't wanted to face. "When I was there," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "I felt like the place was waiting for me, like time wasn't just showing me something. It was holding a door open." Her fingers pulled at the hem of her sweater. "And ever since I came back, I keep wondering if the door didn't close all the way." The thought lingered between us, unsettling in its quiet possibility. Outside, the wind picked up briefly, brushing dry leaves across her porch in a soft scatter. But inside, everything remained unnervingly still. "What if time isn't a line?" she continued, her voice breaking. "What if it's a room? And once you step into part of it, the rest of it knows you've been there." I wanted to tell her no, that wasn't how the world worked. But the truth was, the more she spoke, the less certain I felt about anything I thought I knew. "Let's take this one moment at a time," I said. "Tell me exactly what you're feeling right now. Not yesterday, not there, just right now." She pressed a hand to her chest, breathing shallowly. "Right now, I feel like she's close. Not the older me, the girl." Her voice trembled, as if she stepped a little closer when the light flickered. I swallowed. "Why do you think she's reaching out to you?" Her eyes softened with something fragile. "Because she sounded like she knew me, not my name. Me. And that scares me more than anything else." I moved slightly closer, not touching, just bridging the space enough so she wouldn't feel alone. "What do you want to do?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. Too long. The kind of silence that builds pressure rather than relieving it. Finally she said, "I need to know who she is." The simplicity of the statement carried an unexpected weight, as if understanding this unknown girl was the only thread keeping Margaret anchored to herself. Before I could respond, a soft shift of sound came from down the hallway, the faintest whisper of movement, like fabric brushing against wood. Margaret's head snapped toward the sound. "That's exactly what I heard last night," she said, her voice barely audible. I stood slowly, my heartbeat steady but heavier than before. "Stay here." She rose instantly. "No, Norman. I can't sit and wait for something I can't see." We approached the hallway together, our footsteps quiet against the carpet. The shadows seemed longer again, stretched in unnatural angles by the low light filtering from the living room. Halfway down the hall, Margaret stopped. "What is it?" I whispered. She pointed toward the floorboards near the base of the wall. "There. Do you see it?" I squinted, letting my eyes adjust. A thin line of light, no wider than a thread, glowed faintly between the floorboard and the wall. Not bright, not flickering, just present. A soft pale glow, like a breath held beneath the wood. "That wasn't there before," she whispered. I crouched slowly and reached a hand toward it. The air above the glowing seam felt colder, not physically cold, but hollow, as if the warmth of the world pulled back from it. "Norman," Margaret whispered urgently, "don't touch it." I pulled my hand back. The glow dimmed, then brightened again with a soft pulse, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "That's what I felt before I slipped," she said. A pulse, like the world was holding a breath I wasn't supposed to hear. The glow pulsed again, soft, steady, and then, floating up from that narrow line of light, came a sound, a child's whisper, so faint it barely formed a word, but unmistakable. "Margaret, Her knees buckled slightly, and I reached out just in time to steady her. She clutched my sleeve, her voice shaking. "Norman, she's already here." Margaret's grip on my sleeve tightened, her fingers trembling as if she were holding on to the last solid thing in a world coming undone around her. The thin seam of pale light along the floorboard continued its quiet pulse, steady and soft, as though it had been there for years, waiting for someone to notice. I held her steady, feeling a heaviness settle across my shoulders. Not panic, just a sober understanding that whatever was happening wasn't something we could dismiss anymore. "Let's step back," I murmured. Margaret didn't move. She stared at the glowing seam with an expression that wasn't fear alone. It was recognition, painful familiarity, as though she were seeing something she couldn't name but somehow already knew. "I think she's trying to reach me," she whispered. "I think she's been trying, for longer than I realized." Her voice shook in a way that made my chest tighten. I guided her back a step, not away from the hallway completely, just enough to put a small distance between us and that thin line of impossible light. It dimmed slightly as we moved, like a signal softening. "Margaret," I said, keeping my tone steady. "What you heard, that whisper, do you think she's the girl you saw or didn't see in the photograph?" Margaret swallowed hard. "I don't know, but something in me feels drawn to her." She pressed a hand to her sternum, like I already carry a piece of her without knowing how. We stood in the dim hallway, shadows stretching across us like quiet spectators. I could faintly hear the ticking of the living room clock behind us, soft, steady, grounding. But everything in front of us felt altered, the air thinner, the silence deeper. "Let's go back to the living room," I suggested gently. "We can think clearer there." She hesitated, then nodded. I walked with her, staying close in case she faltered. When we reached the couch, she sat down slowly, her posture collapsing into a kind of quiet exhaustion. I pulled a chair closer, sitting across from her. "I didn't want to believe any of this," she said, her voice low. "I thought the older version of me was the only impossibility I'd ever have to face. But now," her eyes drifted to the kitchen doorway, where the shadows were thickest. "Now, I keep wondering if the older me wasn't alone in that moment. If the girl was there too, somewhere behind the door, waiting for me to see her." The idea settled coldly in my stomach. "Margaret," I said, "tell me something plainly. When you heard the child's whisper last night, did it feel like she was calling for help, or calling you?" Margaret stared at the carpet for several long seconds. When she answered, her voice was barely audible. "It felt like she wanted me to find her." A quiet heaviness filled the room. She lifted her hands to her face, pressing her palms against her eyes as though trying to block out a memory that hadn't yet fully formed. "I keep replaying the sound," she said, the way she said my name. There was a softness in it, Norman, a sadness, like she knew I wouldn't understand, but hoped I would try. I felt something shift inside me, an uncomfortable truth pressing into place. This wasn't random. It wasn't a hallucination or a trick of Margaret's frightened mind. There was a pattern here, threading itself through time, linking the older woman she saw, the photograph withheld, the child's whisper, and the thin seam of light glowing beneath her floorboards. "Tell me something else," I said softly. "When you were there, in that future, did anything feel incomplete? Like someone was supposed to be with you but wasn't?" Margaret's eyes widened slowly, as though the question had reached a part of her memory she had tried not to examine too closely. "Yes," she whispered. "I felt alone in a way that didn't make sense, as if a presence was missing. Someone who belonged in that moment but wasn't there." She drew a slow breath, her voice unsteady. "And now I'm starting to wonder if the girl wasn't absent because she didn't belong there." Her gaze drifted toward the hallway again, her eyes shining with something fragile and raw. Maybe she wasn't there yet, because she was here. A quiet tremor went through her. She curled her fingers against her palms. "Norman," she whispered, "what if the girl is from the same place the older me came from? What if she's not my past or my future, but a moment I haven't lived and already regret?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "And what if time is trying to bring us together before I break her too?" I didn't answer Margaret right away. Some questions don't need answers, only space to breathe. I watched her sit there, her shoulders lifting and falling with shallow breaths, her fingers trembling as if she were holding back something too heavy to name. Outside, the wind brushed weakly against the windows, A soft reminder that the ordinary world still existed just beyond the walls of her home, even if it felt impossibly far away. "Margaret," I said slowly, "whatever this girl represents, whoever she is, you're not responsible for something you haven't done." She shook her head gently, her hair brushing her cheeks. "But that's the thing, Norman. It doesn't feel like something I haven't done. It feels like something I've already done, and just don't remember." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Or something time hasn't let me remember yet." That thought lodged itself somewhere deep, unsettling in a way I couldn't easily shake. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "When you saw the older version of yourself," I asked carefully, "did she seem alone?" The question struck her. I saw it in the way her breath hitched, in the way her gaze drifted off to the side as if chasing a memory. "She did," Margaret said. "She looked like someone who had carried a loneliness for years, a loneliness that didn't come from being without people, but from being without someone specific." "The girl?" I asked softly. A tear slipped down Margaret's cheek before she even noticed. She wiped it away quickly, embarrassed, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. "I can't explain it," she said. "I don't know her, but I feel connected, as if seeing her, hearing her, unlocked something, not a memory, something deeper." She placed a hand on her chest. "Like I've been missing someone without knowing it." The room dimmed slightly as a cloud passed over the fading daylight outside. The shadows shifted softly across the carpet, moving in slow waves. Margaret glanced toward the hallway, her expression tightening. "I heard her again this morning," she whispered. Not a whisper, just breathing. Soft, close enough that I thought someone was standing behind me. My pulse quickened, but I kept my voice steady. "And what did you do?" "I turned around," she said, but the room was empty, the way empty things always are. Nothing moved, nothing changed. She shivered. "Except me. I changed." "How?" I asked. She lifted her chin, trying to steady herself. "I didn't feel afraid. Not the way I should have been. It felt like hearing a child in the next room. A child you're responsible for. A child who shouldn't be alone." Her words sank into me with a weight I didn't expect. This wasn't panic. This wasn't delusion. This was recognition. A truth waiting to surface. "And now," she continued, "the more the house goes quiet, the more I feel her. Not as a threat, not as a stranger, but as someone who's waiting for me to understand." Another soft pulse of the porch light flickered across the wall, reflected faintly from outside. Margaret noticed immediately, her breath catching. "That flicker," she whispered. "Do you see how it pauses? That's the same rhythm I felt there, on that street in the future, when the older me looked at me like she had run out of time." The idea tightened something inside me, an invisible line connecting all the scattered pieces. "What if," Margaret continued, voice low and unsteady, "time isn't trying to warn me? What if it's trying to return something to me? Something I lost in a moment I don't remember yet." Her voice broke and she pressed a hand to her eyes. "And what if the girl is the one who pays for that moment?" I stood and knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on the arm of her chair, not touching her, just close enough for her to feel my steadiness. "Margaret," I said softly, "you're not that older woman yet. The future isn't fixed. You still have choices." She looked at me with tearful, aching eyes. "But what if the moment that matters has already happened? What if I've already set everything in motion, and time is only letting it reach me now?" Before I could respond, a soft creak echoed from the hallway. Just one, subtle and quick, like a small footstep settling weight onto the boards. Margaret's breath hitched sharply. "She's close," she whispered. "I can feel her." And when I turned toward the hallway, the faint seam of light beneath the floorboards pulsed again. Slow, steady, patient, waiting. For a moment neither of us breathed. The seam of pale light in the hallway pulsed faintly, as if responding to Margaret's trembling voice. I stood slowly, keeping my movements calm, measured, not wanting to startle her, or whatever else pressed quietly against the edges of our world. "Margaret," I said gently, "stay here. I'll take a look." But she shook her head immediately, her expression tight and fearful. "No. If she's close, if she's reaching out, I don't want her to think I'm turning away." Her words carried a quiet ache that unsettled something deep inside me. She wasn't talking about fear anymore. She was talking about responsibility, an unearned guilt, a bond she didn't understand, a thread she didn't remember tying. I stepped toward the hallway, glancing back to make sure she followed at her own pace. She did, slowly, one hand brushing the wall as though grounding herself against a current she couldn't see. The house felt different now. The air wasn't colder exactly, but heavier, thicker with a stillness that reminded me of hospitals at night, the kind of silence that holds more emotion than sound. Margaret stopped behind me, eyes fixed on the faint glow. "The pulse is slowing," she whispered. She was right. The soft rhythm of light dimmed slightly, then brightened again at a gentler pace. It felt expectant, patient, like someone waiting to be acknowledged. I crouched again, careful not to touch the floorboards. "Margaret," I said softly, "if you feel anything at all, tell me." She hesitated, then stepped closer. Her breath shook. "When I look at that light," she said, "I don't feel fear." She paused, voice wavering. "I feel heartbreak, deep heartbreak, like something inside me recognizes a loss I haven't lived yet." The honesty in her voice hit me with quiet force. She wasn't imagining, she wasn't exaggerating. She was remembering something that hadn't happened yet. A soft click sounded overhead, the frame of the house adjusting, or perhaps something else settling into place. Margaret tensed and pressed a hand to her chest. "That feeling," she whispered. "It's happening again." "What feeling?" "As if time is folding," she said. "Like what happened to me before. Like a moment is trying to reach me again." Her breath came uneven now, like she was fighting against something inside her own memory. I steadied her gently with a hand on her arm, not pulling her back, just letting her know she wasn't alone. "Margaret," I murmured, "what's coming back to you?" She closed her eyes tightly, holding onto the silence for several seconds before letting out a strained whisper. "When I was there, I wasn't alone." Her face tightened, pain flickering beneath her eyelids. "I thought the older me was speaking only to me, but there was someone else, right behind the door." I could hear her breathing. Her voice broke. "I think she wanted to come out, but couldn't." A faint shudder rippled through her as she opened her eyes again, eyes shining with fear and grief existing side by side. "And now," she whispered, "I think she followed me back. Not the woman, the girl." The light pulsed again, soft, slow, steady. I felt something shift beneath the floorboards, not movement, but presence, as if whatever lay beneath that seam of light was listening. "Norman," Margaret said quietly. "She knows me." Her voice held no doubt, no hesitation, just a soft, weary truth. "She knows me the way you know a person you've cried for, or waited for, or hurt." She drew a shaky breath. I think I'm the reason she's still calling." The realization washed through her in real time, her expression folding into something fragile and devastated. "I didn't understand the older me," she whispered. "I thought she was warning me, but now I think maybe she was grieving." The light flickered, then steadied again. One last pulse that lingered. Margaret stepped closer, barely a few inches, her hand trembling as she lifted it toward the seam. "Maybe she's been trying to reach me, because she knows what I'll become." Her voice broke. "And maybe she's the part of me I lose." The room fell into a silence so complete it felt sentient, waiting for what Margaret would understand next. But whatever that understanding was, it hadn't arrived yet. It was still just ahead of her, and she was still walking toward it. I've spent a long time trying to understand what happened in Margaret's house that night. I've replayed every sound, every flicker of light, every quiet shift in the air. And the more distance I put between myself and that moment, the more I understand that distance doesn't soften it. If anything, it sharpens the edges. I never saw the girl myself. Not clearly, not in any way I could point to. But I felt her. In the stillness, in the hush of the hallway, in the way Margaret's voice faltered whenever the world slipped just slightly out of place. Whatever crossed into our lives, it wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It came gently, like a memory stepping forward before its time. Margaret changed after that night, not in ways most people would notice. She still swept her porch in the mornings, still tended to her plants, still waved to neighbors passing by. But there was something quieter in her, as if she'd begun carrying a truth that didn't belong to the present moment, a truth she couldn't unsee. And every so often, if I passed her window just after dusk, I'd see her standing there in the half-light, looking toward the hallway, listening for something only she could hear. She never told me if the girl's voice returned. She never talked about the older version of herself again. But she didn't have to. I could see it in her posture, in the way she paused before turning off the lights at night. Some people believe time moves forward and leaves the past behind, but I've learned it isn't always that simple. Sometimes time reaches back. Sometimes it brings us a glimpse of who we might become. And sometimes, if the moment is heavy enough, it returns the parts we're afraid to face. Margaret never said what she ultimately found in that house, but whatever it was, it never left her untouched.